Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about SARS with a script provided by Justin Crockett. I'm sure the comments section totally isn't going to be a dumpster fire with this one. In all of our modern human history, nothing shook us quite like the 2020 COVID lockdowns. It seems like forever ago already, but try to remember just how weird it all was. For example, my beard was still brown and I just barely started science yet. Stress is a hell of a thing, people. One day, we were going around touching doors and politely coughing on each other. The next, you can't get a sandwich at a deli. Flights were grounded, trailers were shipped to hospitals just to handle the bodies, and mandatory quarantines brought out the absolute best and worst in humans. We still haven't recovered from it, honestly. And we're still not sure if movie theaters will survive for much longer either. Go to the movies, people. Please. I love the movies. But keep in mind the name of the virus, COVID-19. That's short for Coronavirus Disease 2019. This was not our first brush with the bug, which is caused by the SARS, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome virus. It was by far the deadliest, with over 7 million deaths and counting, but it was just a strain of a pathogen that the world had been dealing with since around 2002. Much like you download the newest iOS on your phones, the SARS virus has been installing its own updates over the last 2 decades. And that is a weird way to explain the process of how viruses evolve, but you get the idea. The reason you may not have remembered them very well is most likely the passing of time and the way the news cycles constantly refresh. But make no mistake, these could have very well taken some random bad turns and thrown the world into chaos just like COVID-19 did. Around 2002, SARS-CoV-1 came to be in southern China. It was believed to have been transmitted by bats or small creatures in the nearby countryside, and was a relatively centralized, albeit serious, illness. This area of the world is very infamous for its markets that feature live animals on display for the purpose of eventually butchering and consuming them. It's said that the fresher the kill, the better the health of the individual eating it. A customer picks what they want and the vendor kills it right there in front of them. These markets, often called wet markets, are huge breeding grounds for viruses that can be transmitted from animal to human. Eventually, scientists discovered that a man from Guangdong, China, who likely prepared foods from these markets, was the first documented case of SARS on November 16, 2002. Our patient zero. He, his wife, his aunt, and his niece would all die within a few weeks. In January 2003, a fishmonger at one market named Cho Zuafen checked himself into a hospital in Guangdong province, where he spread what was then still a mystery illness to 30 doctors and nurses there. It wouldn't be until February of next year that the ears of the World Health Organization perked up. At this point, they were aware of roughly 300 cases, mostly originating from China. That would quickly change. They started issuing warnings about a virus from a then unknown source after hospitals in Hong Kong and Vietnam started filling up with patients with pneumonia and flu symptoms. The WHO put out a global alert in early 2003, which puts health officials who deal with policy on guard to watch for outbreaks in their respective areas. They started tracking patients of interest, specifically a businessman from Shanghai named Johnny Chen, who passed away from a respiratory virus in a hospital in Vietnam. He ended up there after traveling from Hong Kong with signs of illness already being exhibited. But during this 2 hours worth of travel, he helped to complicate a regional illness into what had potential to become a global pandemic. He wasn't alone in his efforts, however. While in Hong Kong, Chen stayed at the swanky Metropole Hotel, in a room on the 9th floor. Unbeknownst to him, he was sharing the floor with a Chinese doctor named Liu Xianlun, who would go on to become one of those famous super spreaders, a term you probably became familiar with in the last few years. Xianlun, being a respiratory-focused physician, had been working in a southern China hospital tending to some of the very first SARS patients, including one Mr. Cho Zuanfun. He wished to travel to a wedding of a family member, but he had become symptomatic. He got a chest x-ray done, which was clear. So he took off to Hong Kong, and there at the hotel he directly infected 23 people that we know of in one night's stay. Instead of attending the wedding, he walked over to a nearby hospital after waking with a fever, and he would never leave his hospital room, and died there on March 4th. Another of those infected was a tourist from Toronto. The 78-year-old woman had also stayed on the same hotel floor as the Chinese doctor. She wasn't symptomatic on the flight back to Canada, and no one else on the flight is thought to have taken ill, but a few days after she arrived home, she too was sick. On February 28th, she saw her doctor and was prescribed antibiotics for a presumed respiratory infection. She did not improve and died at her home on March 5th, just a day after the doctor that infected her died. A whole world away. And that, kids, is how an epidemic becomes a pandemic. The Canadian woman would infect 60 people in her few days back home before dying. Johnny Chen would get several hospital staff members sick in Vietnam. On March 4th, back in Hong Kong, another previous guest at the Metropole Hotel entered the hospital and would directly infect almost 100 people. 3 or 4 people directly ignited massive outbreaks in 4 countries spanning the globe, and the WHO would make a startling estimation once the outbreak was contained months later. The doctor staying at the Metropole Hotel for a single night likely contributed to half of the SARS cases in the entire world. Wild, right? By this point, the WHO started issuing travel warnings to people in Hong Kong, Vietnam, Singapore, and the United States. The Centers for Disease Control in the US quickly did the same. On March 25th, officials in Ontario, the governing province of Toronto, where a single tourist returning from Hong Kong created a local crisis, issued their own SARS declaration. This opened up avenues for emergency operations, including standardizing reporting of cases and restricting public activity if necessary. Labs across the globe got together and started a network to study and treat what they now knew was a new coronavirus on March 15, 2003. Coronaviruses weren't particularly novel to science. Even the common cold was a type of coronavirus. The word corona is Latin for crown, and under a microscope the virus does seem to have crown-like projections on its surface. These spikes are a type of protein that help the virus enter host cells and create an infection. But the rapid spread and higher mortality rate than most coronaviruses had researchers scrambling. 2 days later, the CDC held its first formal briefing on the new SARS virus, adding that there were approximately 14 cases now in the United States. As the labs worldwide began to sequence the DNA of the virus, they learned how it was transmitted and hoped that could slow down the progress it was rapidly making. Protective equipment was shipped to healthcare facilities in vast numbers. Those infected and those exposed were subjected to strict quarantines to manage the outbreak. Tracing of patients and people they interacted with was crucial as well. It's also worth mentioning the ease with which the virus spread. It was literally traveling the world. As the sick and infected took to airports and public transit stations, SARS went where they went. Researchers learned that it transmitted through respiratory droplets. When someone coughed, the virus could travel several feet through the air. If someone touched their nose or mouth with their hands, and then another surface, that left the virus there for someone else to receive into their system. You know, all this should sound familiar. By April 2003, the SARS outbreak was still mostly centered in southern Asia and China. China, however, suffered many accusations of misreporting infection numbers. Part of this can be attributed to their healthcare system simply being overwhelmed, but it was also a case of a lot of local municipalities passing the blame. No one wanted to be responsible for harboring scores of sick people. They also took several months to even announce the outbreak of SARS at all. So it's very likely that public mistrust of the government and its reporting of actual truthful case numbers contributed to an ironic rise in numbers. Think about it. If your local government isn't visibly worried about keeping people home and safe, why would you be? As April rolled on, some countries saw their efforts to nullify the outbreaks rewarded by dwindling numbers of cases. Others, like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China, saw death tolls rise. China, for their part, enacted a major shift in awareness policy and was now reporting cases daily, likely because the premier of China threatened punishment to local officials if they did not do so. The mayor and health minister in Beijing were quickly fired for their mishandling of the epidemic. Schools and colleges were closed to slow transmission. Over in Taiwan, the death rate was so drastic, over 20% mortality rate, officials made the shocking decision to fully shut down a major hospital in the city of Taipei. That's a bold choice by itself, but they actually forced the entire staff of over 900 employees as well as 200 patients to remain in the locked down facility for 2 weeks. It was an unpopular decision to say the least. Nurses hung banners from the windows protesting the measures, and some staff were arrested when they tried to leave. Again, sound familiar? China's new health minister took over on April 26th and immediately closed down many parts of Beijing, including clubs and theaters, as they remained the hardest hit area in the world. Their economy was suffering as well, as many factories and manufacturing facilities were shuttered. The soccer Women's World Cup that was to be held there was moved to the United States. It's estimated China alone lost almost $1.4 billion in the months that SARS was at its worst. But all was not bleak. Vietnam, which had its own massive cluster of infections at the start of the pandemic, reported in late April that they had no new cases in 20 days. A few days later, Toronto had its travel warnings removed by the WHO. It seemed 2 hotspots were cooling off. As the calendar flipped to May, even Hong Kong saw cases drop to single digits in new daily cases. The world wasn't completely out of the woods, though. Toronto saw a very quick spike of 20 suspected cases in late May, which led to a cautionary quarantine of 7,000 citizens. It wasn't until mid-summer when the severely afflicted areas of the world like Canada and Hong Kong would be removed from the WHO's list of infected countries. Taiwan was cleared in July. This wasn't due to any kind of radical methods, just very boring and consistent measures like quarantines, public education, travel, and economic restrictions, and patient tracing. All told, 774 people died from the SARS outbreak. Over 8,000 were infected that we know of. Stigmas about new viruses being what they are, you can probably count on many unreported cases. Random and isolated cases would pop up from time to time in the next several months, but for the most part, the world had recovered from the pandemic. Certain types of animals that were thought to harbor the disease were removed from the wet markets in China, and by late 2004 into 2005, the world had no recorded cases of SARS. Of course, as time marches on, the memory becomes less dependable, and the very same negligent practices that got us into the SARS mess eventually led us into the 2020 pandemic. Shady practices with diseased animals at wet markets, faulty reporting, and refusal to follow hygiene and health safety practices would make the potential horrors that SARS represented in 2003 a reality for the entire world 17 years later. Well, I hope you enjoyed this bite-sized bio, and if you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and tell the YouTube algorithm to spread this video faster than okay, maybe I shouldn't make a SARS joke here. You get the idea. You can read more from Justin at his site, Business Handshakes, which is linked in the description. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.